So our first speaker today is Giles Chamberlain. Giles has been in the video conferencing industry since 1988. He's currently CTO of Pexip, a company he co-founded in 2012 and which floated on the Norwegian Stock Exchange last summer. He's got a particular interest in security in this domain. Pexip are currently working with the National Cybersecurity Centre to advise on security standards for video conferencing. So it's fair to say over the last 12 months have been pretty busy for him. So we're grateful he's taking the time to be with us today. So over to you, Giles.
So yes, as Steve was saying, I'm the CTO at Pexip. We're a Norwegian company. I'm going to work very hard to make sure that this is not a sales pitch on behalf of us. So I'm going to be anonymizing all sorts of pieces. But it's been an interesting year and has brought video conferencing very much to the highlight. So what I want to try and cover today is looking back at the history of video conferencing, particularly from a security point of view, and seeing what's happened there over the last few years, and then taking that forwards and looking on again to where we're going from there. So we're going to be covering the history of video conferencing, looking at the year video took off, and then what's being marketed for security in 2021, and then moving on from there to what you should actually be looking for in security in 2021 and beyond. Scary thing is that video conferencing is over 50 years old. This is AT&T launching the picture phone at the World Trade Fair in 1965. And I'm of about the right age to be the young lad on her lap, but we'll gloss over that one. Suffice to say that at this stage, security was not a key topic of conversation. And in fact, video conferencing wasn't a key topic of conversation either, until telecommunications improved substantially. And we moved on to ISDN, for those of you old enough to remember that. Basically digital telephony, 64 kilobits per channel, complicated ways of bonding multiple channels together. And at last, you could get enough bandwidth for an interesting video conference experience. This particular photograph is an early Tandberg Vision 10 system that was built for BT, which basically launched the company. One of the reasons for including it is the gentleman on the far right is on my board, so I'm very interested in embarrassing him in public wherever possible. So we'll let him cringe at that one. At this point, video conferencing was an extension to telephony. The security on the systems was exactly that on a telephone handset, i.e. basically none. You relied on the telecoms company, the telco, to secure the line. That was it. Really wasn't a considered area. And in fact, the history of security in video conferencing pretty much mirrors, although lags by maybe 10 to 20 years, that of the security in email. When email systems started, it was plain text. You could forge the from field with aplomb. Everything worked. And then we started having lots and lots of violations. And we end up with encrypted links to your email server, lots of spam and source authentication protocols. And it became more and more sophisticated. And videos following very much the same approach. Around the year 2000, ISDN was proving to be really difficult for video conferencing. Trying to actually get the call up, getting all these lines bonded together was a nightmare. And there was this new thing out there called the internet. And internet bandwidth was starting to improve and even approach that you could get on ISDN. And so companies started to make hybrid systems. This early, again, it's Tandberg, just to my history. This early Tandberg system had both ISDN and IP connectivity. It's a very careful publicity photograph because these are the old CRTs, 4:3 screen ratio, you can see. They were huge and heavy, but they've carefully tried to make them look small and neat. The problem was, from a security perspective, we carried over the old telephony approach into the internet approach, the IP approach, which was, this is a telephone, you can place calls into it, you can place calls out from it, that's it. Then people started deploying these newfangled things called firewalls, which meant you couldn't place an IP call into a company because it wouldn't go through the firewall. And if you can't place a call into a telephone, that's a bad thing. But the solution seemed quite obvious. Most companies just move their endpoints out into the big bad internet, put them on a public IP address. What could go wrong? At this time, I was working for a company that was coming up with a very early version of what's called firewall traversal, getting voice and video calls through a firewall in both directions. And so I was trying to talk to customers and explain, putting your endpoint out on the big bad internet is a bad thing. And I will confess that on more than one occasion, I telnetted into their endpoint in order to demonstrate why a public IP address was not good. But again, the fact that these devices had a telnet port open, I think speaks volumes as to the approach to security at the time. But we move forwards, and ISDN is now, I was going to say abandoned. We actually had a customer come in recently we had to install an ISDN gateway for. But in general, all of the voice and video that's been going on for the last 5, 6, 7 years is on the internet. The problems of getting voice and video calls through firewalls using our standard protocols have basically been solved. We have standards in there to solve all of that. And all would have been wonderful. But as this slide shows, for a while, video was very much the boardroom darling. You had a huge, expensive system used only by senior management. Most people could never get their hands on it. But computer power started increasing. Laptops could start hosting video calls. There were some early versions around that were really quite usable in 2005, 2006, and it's just improved massively ever since. I'm currently on a laptop talking to you guys. So the democratization of video was fantastic. Everybody could have access to it, but that started bringing in interesting other problems. To make life more interesting still, we had last year. Everybody was trying to work from home where possible. This meant a huge increase in video conferencing usage. All of the video conferencing providers had a massive increase in scale. We all wobbled a bit. There were a lot of late nights worked by people across the various different companies. I'm really proud to say that we all held up in some form or other. And given a tenfold increase in usage, more or less overnight, I think that's really quite important. But on the other side of the house, the end users were finding whatever they could to carry on with their work. Security was definitely not top of mind. More important was, could you get that last webcam off Amazon, because they were all selling out big time. And that caused a few issues. You may have come across this video on the internet. A somewhat unfortunate lawyer in the States, I think he'd let his children use his laptop for a Zoom meeting with their friends or whatever. They had installed a cat filter, which transformed our lawyer into the character in the bottom right, and led to the immortal quote, "I am not a cat." Now, it doesn't initially look like a great security issue, although from an authentication point of view, the statement, "I am not a cat," is on the weak side. But if you look at the frame top left, recording of this hearing or live stream is prohibited, and then various penalties beyond that. And this video is all over YouTube. So from a practical point of view, okay, not much has been leaked. It's not really a problem, but the protocols of this district court totally violated, and the statement, "You must not record this," obviously ignored. Slightly different, but similar sort of problem. Parish Council in the UK recently managed to get itself all over the internet after a meeting got a little bit noisy. The chairman of the meeting, Brian, highlighted in green there, stated forcefully that "you have no authority here" to the parish clerk, as she was threatening to throw him out of the meeting. And apparently, according to their house rules, the only person who could eject anybody from a meeting was the chairman, Brian. Unfortunately, the meeting was being hosted by the parish clerk, so she just kicked him out of the meeting. So we have a discrepancy between the official rules of engagement and the practical rules of who's got the eject button. So again, security issues coming in without consideration as to how they could play out. In this case, made for an interesting internet meme for a while, but in alternative areas, it could be very embarrassing. And then something often called Zoom bombing, which is a bit unfair on Zoom. And in fact, this particular example, I'm going to hold my hand up to because it's our product that was being used. The EU defence ministers were holding a meeting. One of them was self-isolating at home and wanted to prove that she was working. So she tweeted a screenshot of the meeting, which happened to include her joining credentials. The gentleman in the middle on the left-hand side there is a Dutch journalist who saw the tweet and joined the meeting. Everybody was very polite and good-humoured about this, and he left shortly after. But again, not a good thing if you've got somebody joining a high-level political meeting like that who's not meant to be there and is not even wearing a jacket and tie in that case. And there were lots of examples of this, a lot less salubrious over the last year or so. My children have been in remote learning, like I'm sure many of yours have. There have been cases of people publishing their credentials on the internet and asking friends of theirs to break into the meeting, disrupt them, make the lessons slightly more exciting for them. So there's been lots of difficulty around there. So we've seen this mass rollout of video cause some real exposure of security issues. But let's put that to one side for a moment. And let's look where we've been going on a security and marketing on a lot of these products recently. Partly because of this increased engagement, security's become, or the illusion of security, has become a key buzzword in the marketing literature, a tick on requests for quote lists, do you support this? And a lot of it is noise without sort of stepping back and looking at the fundamentals as to what's going on. Couple of examples of that: end-to-end encryption, as used on WhatsApp and so forth, was highly touted by one company. Turned out they weren't doing it at all. I think the marketing department had misunderstood what was involved there. And so that caused a bit of embarrassment. There's been a scrabble. They now support end-to-end encryption in some scenarios, but they can't authenticate who you are encrypting to. And there's another company now coming out again with big statements about we will support end-to-end encryption. When you read the fine print, we will support end-to-end encryption in this tiny scenario. The rest of the time, not. And by the way, by default, we don't do encryption anyway. And then when you get into encryption, you see people waving around, oh yes, we support AES encryption, which sounds great. It's the gold standard of practical encryption methods at the moment. required by all the big government agencies. Great, tick. What more do you need? But again, look at the fine print. And at this point, it's really hard to look at the fine print because you have to be deeply interested in this sort of stuff to dig into it. But AES supports lots of different modes. Some of them are older than others. There's one mode called ECB, Electronic Codebook, which is now deprecated. I think if you were in one of Steve's security lectures and you proposed using AES with ECB mode, you'd get a failing grade for your lecture course. The reason is if you encrypt an image using AES with ECB, the central frame there is showing what that encrypted image looks like. And I think it's reasonably clear to see that you can still make out the penguin. You still know more about what's going on than you should. Change that ECB mode to one of the more modern modes, such as CBC, and you end up with the pseudo noise on the right-hand side, which is what you should be getting. So the point here is not the detail of what encryption algorithm should you be using, just that cryptography, security is hard. Taking a quick stab at putting something in just to get the tick on the sheet might mean you miss the underlying fundamentals. So security has to be front and center of the product that's being developed and has to be a first-class citizen of the feature list of that product. Otherwise, you end up with people taking shortcuts, and that just hurts. So with that bad news about what's going on and how hard it is to actually get to the bottom of what you should be doing, what should you do? And at this point, it's step back. Don't worry about the deep technologies involved. Think about what you're trying to achieve. What data is at risk in your video conferencing solution? Very possibly call data, call metadata. In this particular one, you could go to the logs of the service provider running this and see that I have called into this meeting. I called in at this time, I stayed here for this long, and these other participants were in. That metadata for my Sunday evening call with my friends and a glass of wine is not a problem. I don't particularly care if that gets spread out. It's, yeah, fine. If I was the chairman of Coca-Cola and I was recorded as spending a lot of time talking to the chairman of Pepsi-Cola, then people might start thinking, oh, is there a merger? Is there an acquisition in prospect here? Maybe. And so that metadata suddenly starts having value. Maybe we need to protect that. So you need to consider that and see if that's a problem for you or not. And you also get things like GDPR coming in there as well. The metadata will very likely contain personally identifying information. How are you going to handle that? And considering all of those. And then there's the data in the call. How much of that is being handled by your service provider? If you're getting subcaptions on the text, that means they're doing speech-to-text processing, which means they've got access to the audio data. Is that a problem? Are you concerned by that? Again, you may not be. You may trust your service provider implicitly, which is fantastic, but you need to consider these things and see where it's going. And then if you were to be breached, if that information were to leak, what's the impact of that? Does it matter? Again, my Sunday evening social calls, yeah, that's fine. The Coca-Cola and Pepsi merger, yeah, that's got a high impact if that's breached. Then you get to the ease of use versus security bit. And this is something where a lot of video conferencing suppliers have struggled, particularly over the last year, where we've had a huge influx of new users. They will never change the defaults. They're happy enough if they can get their camera connected, their microphone connected, and everything working. If you've got to go in and turn on encryption as a specific setting rather than transmitting your audio and video in the clear by default, that's never going to happen. if you've got to go in and set a PIN code to allow entry to a meeting, most people are not going to bother. They're just going to let everyone call in. So you've got to consider where your defaults are to make it easy to use, and then also how far you want to go down the process of making the system harder to use, but make it more secure. At one extreme, we have customers who've decided not only do they not trust us as a service provider, they don't trust the internet, so they bought our software, they've installed it air-gapped from the internet in their own data centers. The particular customer has no shortage of scary-looking armed guards available who ensure that data center is secure, and they run everything under their own control. They know that metadata can't get leaked. They know that any data that's recorded in the call cannot be leaked. They're happy with that one. But they've got the downside. They've got to run their own system. Another example of security versus ease of use. One of the companies that's doing end-to-end encryption, as I mentioned, can't authenticate the users that they are encrypting to. Their suggestion in their latest white paper is that you transmit a 23-digit checksum to each user out of band to verify the encryption keys in use. That's an added complexity. So if you don't need the guaranteed security of that, you're not going to go down that route. And then the final piece, which is stepping back and saying, who's the threat? What are you actually protecting yourself against? Are you worried about nation state actors? In which case you've got a huge number of problems. And yes, maybe the transmitting 23-digit keys is a good thing to do. If you're just worried about somebody gate crashing your meeting inadvertently, maybe just lock in the meeting room before you start talking about the redundancies in your company or whatever. It is a good route to go. So summing that all up, I think it's fairly clear that video is going to remain a core piece of collaboration technology going forwards. In fact, it's going to be more than that, I think. Now, as we've all been working from home for so long, as we go back to the office, it's going to be at a slightly reduced rate, I think, to the way we were working before. A lot of people will say, oh, can I work from home today, please? So you're going to have meetings where half of the people are in the meeting room, half of the people are on video at home, some will be on posh boardroom systems, some will be on a laptop in the kitchen. So that's going to remain there, and we've got to adapt to using that. So when you're evaluating a solution, don't just look at all the shiny features. In fact, some of those shiny features might actually be a handicap in the way you're intending to use it. I think the key example there would be the cat filter. Not something you're going to need in most business situations, and it's something else you can shoot yourself in the foot with, so avoid. But what you do need to try and consider from the very beginning is security. Trying to bolt that on afterwards, either by changing your requirements of what your users have got to do, or suddenly seeing that your solution no longer fits your security requirement and you've got to swap it out. That's painful. So think about it from day one. And in order to think about it, you've got to step back and look at the risks and your risk appetite and see where you want to go with that. And that's really my view, my thoughts on video conferencing and security in this brave new world that we're in.
Okay, well, many thanks, Giles, for a great overview of some of the security issues underlying video conferencing that you have to worry about.